Welcome to Hochoka Podcast.
What happens when a jaded adolescent living in Roman luxury and urban pretension finds himself transplanted to a tribal society with deep connections to the land? What lesson does his story contain for us? Hello, Matakiepi. Welcome to Hochoka, here at the center of St. Joseph's Indian School's campus. I'm Scott Wooster, today's Hochoka host. We're glad you have joined our circle to hear Dr. Damian Costello. He joins us again today to bring another fresh perspective on Catholicism through an Indigenous lens. Today we discuss Celtic and Indigenous connections. So welcome again, Damian.
Thanks, Scott. Great to be here.
We unpacked St. Patrick quite a bit, his early life, some of his transformation in our first episode. And we got to the point where he was in Ireland and then made his, had a vision that he was going to return back to England, which he did, to his family, to his growing up place or his villa, and then was set to return back to Ireland. Can you pick the story up from there with where we're headed with this today?
Sure. So Patrick escaped his captivity of 6 years. He went back home, thought he was there for life, and had another vision to go back to Ireland. The people had called him back. And so he had decided also to become a holy person. He became a priest. Probably took about 10 years, and then found himself on the same ocean that he was on when he was 16 years old. So think of that juxtaposition of the 16-year-old boy. He's got that iron collar around his neck. He's chained up. He had just seen many of the people he knew and loved killed, and it was being taken away, probably never to return. And there he was, maybe about 30 years old, going back again. That same ocean, but this time out of his own free will and love for the people, and I think love for the land. He wanted to return. And so in that moment, he was also enacting what is a very important trope in Irish tradition. People from Ireland understood themselves coming from elsewhere, that there had been successive waves of people that had come to Ireland and made it their home. And there's different ways that that's told. But one of them is the fifth people, the Gaels, came back. And there's, all these sort of epic battles and things that happen. But Amergin, who's this poet warrior who's crossing the ocean, and he chants this chant, not really a song, not just poetry, somewhere in between. And in it, he invokes the power of everything around him and says, I am the wind, I am the waves, I am the ocean, I am the eagle above, I am the power of the bull. All these different images. And in an Indigenous way, when you say those things, it's not just poetic. It's not just something that you're convincing yourself of. You're actualizing the power the spirits have given you. And so, as the leader, he goes ashore and he wins the battle and makes Ireland his home. And so you can sort of see Patrick reenacting that, especially in the story that comes with the lighting of the Paschal fire.
Okay. Can you tell us a little more about the Paschal fire?
With Paschal fire, I think many of us who are Catholic know that on Easter Vigil, the first thing that happens is a fire that's lit outside the church, which represents the resurrection of Christ. Well, it seems as if, it's not totally clear, but there are scholars out there who say it's most likely that St. Patrick started that tradition. That wasn't part of the Catholic tradition before then. And that was drawn on the Irish tradition that we talked about the equinox fires.
Yep.
He was coming back in the springtime, and the celebration was Bealtaine, where all the fires were put out. There was one sacred fire that was lit, and it was lit by the king. And from that fire, the fire was brought back to all the other hearths in the tribe. Right, that there was this renewal of the fire.
Yep.
That's supposed to bring fertility to the grass, which in turn feeds the cattle. much like out here, right? When the rains come in the spring, the grass return, the buffalo thrive, the people thrive. So Patrick shows up, and this is also Easter time. And so the story goes is that he said, I'm lighting that Paschal fire, which he sort of maybe came up with, saying like this is a good way to represent the rebirth of the Son of God, of the Creator, despite what the king says. Well, so the king hears about this and gets very agitated, and he sends his band of warriors after Patrick and his followers. And so they start chasing him, and they're running away, and the king and his followers are getting closer, and so Patrick chants a chant, just like Amergin. And we know this chant now by the name the Deer's Cry, or St. Patrick's Breastplate. And it's a beautiful song. Usually it's sung today. But what it does is it has the sort of main components of what Indigenous ceremony do. You know, in Lakota context, the first thing you do, you honor the 6 directions, 7 directions, right? And all the beings around you. You make relationship with all the spiritual powers around you. And so the first thing that Patrick does is he says, I bind myself today to the power of the sun, the moon, the sea, the rock, the earth, all the different powers around him. And then in the middle of the song, it goes into invoking the various powers that the spirits gave him. And so he talks about he's seeing with the eyes of God, God's shield is around him, all the different sort of powers that we associate with ceremony that we're asking for, particularly if you're going into battle. And then the final part is he calls or describes Christ being in him, before him, behind him, to his right, to his left, all around him. And there's a very beautiful analogy or a similar practice in the Navajo way. At the end of the Beauty Way ceremony, there's a song that says, beauty be before me, beauty be behind me, to my right, to my left, above me, below me, exactly the same way, invoking spiritual power and beauty all around you. And so in the Catholic way, one thing they say is that Christ is our beauty. Despite his mangled body on the cross, that and his resurrected body is the most beautiful thing in creation. And so by Patrick saying, Christ in me, before me, behind me, he's also saying, may beauty be before me and behind me and all around me, just like the Navajo say. So my sense is that this is an Irish version, an Indigenous Irish version of Patrick's Catholic spirituality that he sings at that moment.
So much to unpack. I mean, really, truly, you could almost take a couple of days to shake that whole thing out. And you hit it on the head when you said the 6 directions or 7 directions, and the native, even the Lakota people here, the Indigenous people. When I take the kids out to the horse barn and we stand in a circle with the horses, we always sing our directional song, right? I sing it to the 4 directions and above and below. And I think when you're connected to the land, whatever culture you are, when you're deeply connected to what's going on above, below, and all around you, you just have those connections, and it feels right. But what strikes me is that you have Patrick, who was a spoiled kid, and then a seeker, right? And then he comes back and becomes a priest, and goes back with all this faith and connection, and crosses the ocean to go back to Ireland. But he's definitely got a lot more power than he had the first time he went across on the boat. If the King of England is chasing him back across the water, he's got some power there too.
Well, this would have been a tribal chief, like one of the tribes in Ireland.
I got you. Yep.
But he has power, and that's what the story illustrates. So the way the story goes is, as he's singing, they crest one of the hills, and they go out of sight. And the warrior band and the tribal chief go over that same hill, and they don't see Patrick and his followers. And so they keep going over the next hill, and they still don't see him. They do see some deer up under some trees, but they keep going, and they can't find him. And so the meaning of the story is that Patrick and his followers have transformed into deer through this song. Now, I think a lot of modern people would be like, oh, well, that's an interesting story, ha, 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 or, would find reasons to say, well, that couldn't happen, or it's a myth, or they made it up 100 years later. We know in Lakota way, Indigenous ways, it's very common for people to become animals and for animals to become people. Like that line between the two-leggeds, the four-leggeds, and the winged ones is very fluid. And the Irish people believe that too.
Now the chant that he sang, it became a song called
The Deer's Cry.
The Deer's Cry. And so that has remained, the chant has remained with us to this day and is a contemporary song even now, right? And I think we've got somebody who can sing that for us. Can we take a listen to that?
Let's hear it.
All right.
I arise today through the strength of heaven, light of sun, radiance of moon, splendor of fire, speed of lightning, swiftness of wind, depth of the sea, stability of earth, firmness of rock. I arise today through God's strength to pilot me, God's eye to look before me, God's wisdom to guide me, God's way to lie before me, God's shield to protect me from all who shall wish me ill, afar and near, alone and in a multitude, against every cruel, merciless power that may oppose my body and soul. Christ with me, Christ behind me, Christ before me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ to shield me, Christ in the heart of everyone who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me. I arise today.
So we talked a little bit before going into the song about how one thing that cultures have in common when they're connected to the land, you see those connections between the indigenous people and all around the globe, really. If you're connected to the land, some of those things are just, they're amongst all of us. Nowadays, it seems like we're so disconnected from the land, it's harder to see maybe some of the parallels that you and I have talked a lot. Some of the parallels that we try to draw out, they're not as apparent as they may have been had you been living on the land in that with that close of a connection. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think so many of us miss those connections. And I think not just miss them as in we don't notice them, we miss them on an emotional and spiritual level, and we may not even realize it. For most of human history, all of us, and I think this story is so beautiful in illustrating how even people that we don't think of, Western Europeans, lived in deep connection with the lands and all the spirits around them. And Patrick's journey from a jaded, urban, imperial adolescent to a tribal society where he rediscovered that and rediscovered his own his Catholic faith at the same time, I think is an important lesson for us. And I think the Deer's Cry is a very important asset, a practice to maybe rediscover. Like, learn that song. You can even sing it in church.
Yeah.
And when you do, you're doing two things. Well, you're praising God in the church way, in a very acceptable way for people in the church. But you're also reestablishing connection, growing into those connections in a very indigenous way. It doesn't happen overnight. I know you probably agree with that, Scott. Like, this is a journey that takes a whole lifetime, and you don't know how it's going to turn out. But that's a easy step to take. And so when St. Patrick's Day comes around, lean into it even a bit more.
Yeah. Sing a song, say the chant that's that deeply connected with the history of the land, with the shape-shifting story, with that whole piece of it. I would agree with you 100%. Earlier in this segment, I mentioned missionary. That I said, was he going back to Ireland as a priest to do mission work, to proselytize, those kinds of things? And you said, hang on a second, I'll circle back around. What's your take on that?
So it's absolutely true. He was going back because he wanted to share the gospel. Now when we hear those words today, we have very definite ideas, most of us, of what that is. And it may be sort of painful words for some of us because of what we associate with that. For Patrick, he wanted to share the Jesus way, but there were a lot of things about it that were transformative for those tribal societies in a positive way. Now, there was probably some negative things that came out of it too. But for example, the Christian way gave new agency to women in those societies. Before Christianity came, women were often just property of men. And that's maybe a harsh way of saying it. I'd like to unpack that more. But the reality is that women did not live outside of the expectations that men had. And so you see very quickly lots of women following Patrick because for the first time they could say, you know what, I don't like that marriage that you've arranged for me, Dad. That guy is awful. And you can't make me marry him. There were spaces for women to have authority, to live the lives they wanted to live. It also transformed servitude in some ways. And you see that in the one of the other fire stories about St. Patrick. I love this. St. Patrick has these fire stories. And so this is later in his life where he has churches that he started, and he lights the Paschal fire on the Easter Vigil, and slave raiders show up, this time from Scotland. And this time, they're Christian too. They kill a bunch of people, they take slaves, captives, and bring them back to where they were from. And this was tragic for Patrick. Can you imagine that? Going through this again, the PTSD he must have experienced.
Yeah.
But what he did is he wrote the first document that we have in the history of the world that very explicitly challenged the idea of slavery. And he uses very harsh language, sort of fire and brimstone language, to condemn the slave raider, to say that, you are going to burn in hell because of what you did to these mostly women, and you call yourself a Christian. So he introduced into history, maybe for the first time, this idea that nobody deserves slavery, that slavery in and of itself is awful. Now, did we take that up and run with it?
No.
No, and unfortunately, all too often, Christians have ignored that too, right? But it provided this new spark, a sort of revolution that we're still trying to enact. And I think that's, when we talk about his missionary side, his church side, his indigenous side, it's all mixed up. Sometimes it's complicated, but I can see beauty in all of those sides, and promise, and a person that can inspire us to be the best of all those versions.
The courage it must have taken in those days to be able to stand up and say that, I would imagine it wouldn't have been very popular. So, yeah. Learning more and more about this guy that's starting to impress me quite a bit. So I thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Scott.
Absolutely. And we thank our viewers for joining us here at Ho-Chokeh at the center of St. Joseph's Indian School's campus, where we talk about issues that are central to Native American education today. Until next time, stay centered.